millennia. And they have been used in the same manner also. Hook and line fishing seems to have been considered diachronically as basic, and that is why it's considered suitable for beginners. And here are several instances of long lines separated by centuries, one from the other. A Roman fisherman, a stereotypic literary topos, with skin wrinkled by the sun and nails worn down by salt, as the sources go, and a mid-20th century, wrinkled and sun-scorched poor old fisherman, together with his wife, mend their nets outside their hut. Yet another stereotypical image. I could go on with countless such pairs of similar or even identical images from the long history of fishing around the Aegean in antiquity. It is evident that many elements of fishing, and more broadly of people's relationship with the sea and its creatures, have survived through time, passed down through innumerable generations of fishermen, and reached as far as the 21st century. Over the millennia, everything changed. Borders changed, religion changed, and so did the way people perceived the world. The world itself expanded enormously. Technology developed tremendously, and fishing technology itself became unrecognizable. And yet, in coastal fishing communities, certain things were transmitted from generation to generation for centuries. Knowledge, skills, know-how. I would not like to enter here into a discussion of why this happened. I would, however, like to dwell on a melancholic observation. All this age-old knowledge and perception that we today understand as fishing tradition, or in a more modern terms, fishing cultural heritage, is in great danger of being forgotten. This knowledge, which survived for millennia and constitutes our cultural wealth, risks being lost, failing to pass on to future generations. And thus, what Oppian and Lefkadidis, for example, shared with the readers may become merely an anecdotal story of the past. By forgetting, however, we also lose an opportunity, the opportunity to learn from the past how to manage our world, our sea, and to do so in a sustainable way, in a way that offers hope. With these thoughts, one inevitably arrives at this conclusion. In order to protect something, we must first learn about it, understand it. In the area of the Aegean, we face a gap. The millennia-long history of fishing, and of the many ways in which it influenced culture in the past, has only begun to be systematically studied in the last few decades. Traditional fishing remains largely unexplored, undocumented, and marginal within research. But I'm an archaeologist, so today I will talk to you about fishing in the past as we understand it today, taking into consideration a wide range of evidence. I will start with some orientation and with the background of the research, that is, the ways in which we study ancient fishing and learn about it. The period we are concerned with is this one, Archaic, Classical, Hellenistic, and Roman, the historical period. The region we will be discussing is this one, the Aegean Sea, with its coasts and islands. It is important to keep in mind that the Aegean Sea is not a single uniform entity. Its northern and southern parts differ greatly in terms of water depth, temperature, salinity, nutrient levels, and consequently in the abundance of fish stocks, the species that thrive in its part, and their spatial distribution. For example, in Northern Aegean, the Northern Aegean is strongly influenced by the fact that the fresh waters of many large rivers flow into it, either directly or through the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara. As a result, the waters become eutrophic, rich in nutrients. Large schools of pelagic fish, such as anchovies and sardines, develop there, and their predators gather as well. Schools of tuna, bonitos, mackerel, as well as sharks, whales, dolphins, etc. The Istanbul audience, I'm sure, is very familiar with this abundance, as many of these fish pass through the Bosporus to reach northern Aegean. Because of the hydrogeographical conditions that I just mentioned, the region includes extensive complexes of coastal lagoons and estuarine systems, which are also highly productive fishing areas, with certain types of fish caught there in very large numbers. By contrast, the South Aegean is characterized by cooler, more saline, and generally deeper waters, poor in nutrients. The more eutrophic zones are limited to areas close to the coast, where one finds a variety of species, but each in relatively small numbers. Before global warming disrupted ecological balances, certain species could only be caught locally. For instance, parrotfish could only be found in southern Aegean, not in the north. There are exceptions to this broad picture, of course. Most of the coastal waters of Asia Minor, for example, are particularly rich in fish, and even in the smaller dry Aegean islands, there used to be small, tiny wetlands that offered some very localized richness. The result of all this is that fishing practices were rooted in these natural characteristics and the particular ichthyofauna of each region, creating a mosaic of different fishing approaches. But the situation was even more complex. The Aegean, beyond its natural diversity, was also marked by great cultural, political, and economic diversity. This map, for example, shows the political entities in the region in the mid-5th century before Common Era. And in the inset map, we can see which of them were under the direct or indirect influence and control of Athens. Each of these city-states or kingdoms had its own local tradition and its own way of doing things, including fishing. For instance, it has been observed that many fish names in Boeotia, which is here, just north of Athens, of Attica, the names of the fish in that region differed from those used in Athens and other regions at the same time. The consequence of this fragmentation is that, especially for antiquity, we cannot speak of fishing in general terms. We must always specify the place and time to which we refer. So far we have discussed the when, the where, and let's now consider the how. How do we know about fishing in antiquity? What are our sources? First of all, we have archaeology. A very important source of information is the remains of marine organisms that are found in excavations. These include fish bones and shells of marine mollusks, which were caught by fishermen and brought to the places where the fishermen lived. These are what fishers chose to catch and bring back home because they had some use for it. So, by studying these bones and shells, we gain access to human intention. Here in these two photographs, I show you some typical samples of fish bones. In one case, we have bones of small fish. Each of these bones is just a few millimeters long, they are tiny. And in the other photograph, you see bones of larger fish. Here, you see what is left from some mollusks. In one photograph here, you see limpet shells, and here you see fragments from sea urchins. These elements can be identified, that is, they can be assigned to specific species by comparing the archaeological items morphologically to bones and shells, to modern bones and shells of known species. By making the comparison, we make the identification. A second category of archaeological finds that relate to fishing are some artifacts and structures. Here, first we have the fishing tools, and these are essentially the hard, durable elements of the fishing tools, what survived time. And that's why they are usually made of stone or metal. And here you see two types of fishing weights, these ones made of lead, and two bronze fish hooks. And here is another relevant object, quite common in antiquity, a vessel, an amphora, used to store and trade processed fish. Certain structures, buildings, and installations also relate to the sphere of fishing. For example, here I show you a Roman fish tank at Fermat on Crete. Fish were kept alive in these tanks until they were sold. And here is another example, a fish processing plant, this one in Spain. Two other very important sources of information about ancient fishing are the texts, either literary or epigraphic, and the representations in art. Literary texts, eloquent, captivating, and rich in information, tell us much, especially about fish consumption and perceptions surrounding the sea and its creatures. They also give us the words used about these things in the past. But they can also mislead us. Literary texts represent a specific viewpoint, primarily that of the wealthy, urban, male Athenian, or of somebody with the same characteristics within the cultural influence of literate Athens. Fishing communities, illiterate fishermen, did not write about themselves or their craft, nor did women, slaves, foreigners, and others. Sometimes others spoke about them, but this indirect representation comes with its own problems, of course. In other words, literary texts are themselves objects of the past that must be interpreted if we are to use them properly. Inscriptions, on the other hand, offer more direct testimonies of ancient reality, but they are fewer and they are scattered across space and time. The same challenges apply to artistic representations of fish and fishing. They convey a message, and we must understand the intentions and assumptions behind them. So far, I have spoken a lot about interpretation, about interpreting and understanding the ancient evidence related to the sea and fishing. But since none of us is an old style fisherman or a fishwife, none of us has grown up in a fishing village living alongside other fishermen, we need tools to achieve such understanding. And help comes from two directions. First, from ethnography and anthropology, which show us possible ways in which things may be done or possible functions of ancient objects that we find archaeologically. For example, we understand the archaeological finds on the top row here by viewing and having in mind modern practices like the ones below. This kind of analogy is something that archaeology does all the time, and quite often we don't even think about it. But it's a process of the mind that we need to be aware about. The study of the intangible aspects of the lives of modern fishermen, for example, the organization of fishing labor on a trawler or the maintenance of nets, does not provide automatic parallels with the past, but it does help us to interpret our archaeological finds in a less naive way. Assistance also comes from ecology and the biology of fish and other marine creatures. Their biology and ethology, that is, their behavior and habits, help us understand what is feasible in terms of capturing them. And I remind you here the story about the parrotfish that I told you earlier. Finally, in recent years, hard science, so to speak, has also entered the field of ancient fisheries. Chemistry and genetics help us learn about the contribution of marine foods to diet, the composition and methods of preparation of fish products, the origin of marine foods, the condition of ancient fish populations, and much more. And we use all that to answer questions about fisheries in the past. And a fundamental question is, what was fishing like? What was the character of ancient Aegean fishing? In antiquity, in our region, and indeed throughout the Mediterranean, fishing was what we would today call small-scale coastal fishing. Fishing took place either from the shore or from a boat, close to the shore, in relatively shallow waters. Each fishing operation involved one or two fishermen, or at most a small group, 5 or 6 of them or so. In Attic vase painting of the archaic and classical periods, in the few fishing scenes available to us, we consistently see a stereotypical image, the solitary fisherman casting his hook or a fish trap from the shore. I suspect that this stereotypical image has more to do with moral ideas of the time than the reality. If we broaden our geographical scope, we encounter greater variety. Here, for example, in this 3rd century Roman mosaic from Tunisia in Northern Africa, we see a sea teeming with fish and various fishing methods: rod fishing, traps, nets, cast nets, hand nets, even night fishing with fire. This mosaic fall outside our chronological and geographical focus, but scholars agree that their inspiration, the inspiration of this one and other similar mosaics, lay in Greek literature, which was highly fashionable at the time. This type of fishing yielded a wide variety of species, but in relatively small quantities. A typical catch would include many small and medium-sized fish, up to 20 or 25 centimeters long, and only a few larger ones. The archaeological picture reflects this pattern. Most fishbone assemblages collected and studied from excavations in the Aegean are dominated by small fish, by small fish bones from many species. Bones from larger fish are more rare and often associated with special events, like feasting, for example. Among the smaller fish, the most popular ones used to be the pickerel, the bog, the annular sea bream, the striped sea bream, and the white sea bream. Among the larger species were the majestic grouper, dentex, scorpionfish, small sharks, and rays. And this is how information about fish species in archaeological assemblages is typically published. In this example, I show you what species have been identified in 2 sites on Crete, Hellenistic Komos and late Roman Itanos. And the numbers show the number of bones for each species. You may notice that the small pelagics, the ones which are marked pink, are almost non-existent. And the fish that that thrive in brackish waters, the ones which are marked in gray, they are also very rare. So we can conclude that fishing in this region on Crete was clearly marine, and the catch was very varied. But what happened in areas with rich aquatic ecosystems, such as the northern Aegean or the coasts of Asia Minor? In such areas, there are still significant gaps in research. The environments look like this. River mouths and extensive lagoon systems where fresh and water mix and change seasonally. These so-called transitional waters support large populations of fish and mollusks. Fish move in and out of the lagoons and rivers during their annual reproductive circles, and these movements are more or less predictable, occur en masse, and yield enormous quantities of fish. For precisely these reasons, the predictability, the richness of the output, and the fact that these waters are defined by land, this type of fishing was the first to be included in the legislation of the newly founded Greek state at the end of the 19th century, and probably the Turkish state as well. These fish catches could be easily controlled and taxed, which is the important thing, and that is why it appears in Byzantine and Ottoman documents taxed in ways comparable to agricultural product. Returning to antiquity, let's consider the archaic and classical site of Argylos at the mouth of the Strymon River, near an area of such transitional, on an area of such transitional waters. This is the site. This is a site on the coast of one of the most productive seas in the Mediterranean. The sea is very rich even today in its overfished state, and I'm sure it was extremely rich in antiquity. And fish bones are indeed abundant at this site, Argylos. Their study revealed a surprise. Most of the identified fish bones from Argylos belong to river fish, which is the last column here. Fish from the estuary, the middle column, surely abundant in those waters, are relatively few, mainly mullet and gilthead sea bream. The famous eels of Strymon, this first one, which were really appreciated in distant markets such as that of Athens, are almost absent. We only found a single bone of eel. The marine fish are common, but if you see the total number, they are less than half the freshwater fish. And among them, we have a few small pelagics like these here. We have the normal inshore fish that live near the sea bottom. We have a few larger predators, the cartilaginous fish like sharks, rays, dogfishes, and we have very few migratory fish such as tuna, bonitos, and the like. Now, this is also very strange because those waters undoubtedly were filled with these types of fish, the migratory fish, the sharks, and the small pelagics. But it seems that at Argylos, the fishers turned their back to the fish estuary and the sea, the two very rich water bodies, and they preferred to fish in the river. Argylos raises a fascinating question. What determines the preference of fishermen and fish consumers? Abundance in the water was clearly not the decisive factor, at least in this case. Something else shaped those choices. I cannot now tell you what that is. I have some ideas, but I'm not ready to discuss about it. But The Argylos case brings us to the broader issue of fish consumption in antiquity. What kind of fish and seafood did people around the Aegean prefer? What shaped their taste and preferences? Economic means were obviously crucial. If you lacked resources, you ate what you could catch or afford. People living near the sea consumed what fishermen brought or what they themselves caught. Discussion of choice and preference, in other words, this perception we have about the issue through the written sources mainly concerns the urban affluent consumers. For them, fish were categorized according to several criteria, which were discussed in antithetical pairs. We have, for example, edible fish versus inedible fish, large fish versus small, freshwater fish versus marine fish, fish of dry flesh versus fish of moist flesh. So edibility, size, origin, and texture are key qualities that determine preferences. These alternative systems of classifying and evaluating fish operated within the framework of the marketplace and were connected to matters of ideology. There is clear evidence that there were various arrangements of the fish market and trade. Let's first say that the stereotypical image of the old fisherman that I showed you earlier was just that, an ideal, a literary topos. In reality, fishing was at places a professional, organized, lucrative activity that brought wealth to its practitioners and supplied the urban markets. But let's see how trade in fresh fish was organized. In coastal places, consumers went down to the shore and waited for the fishing boats to return, bringing the catch of the day. We have texts describing this phenomenon, which is also reflected in the many fish bones and seashells that are found in small coastal settlements. Itinerant fishmongers carried fresh fish from the coast to inland regions over long distances. We have, for example, two different pieces of evidence, two inscriptions, which independently inform us about the transportation of fresh fish from Argos, that you see on the map here, a coastal place, to Tegea, up on the mountains, about 60 kilometers away, uphill. Another arrangement for which we know more is that fish were gathered at specific points in the market and were sold by specialized fish sellers. Art, literature, and archaeology all give us details about the way the fish market functioned within cities. Here, for instance, you see a fish shop combined with a butcher's shop in ancient Corinth and dating to the 1st century of the Common Era. We know what this building was not only because of its architecture, but also because above its two entrances it had two inscriptions, one in Latin and one in Greek, saying the exact same thing. What was this place and who was the owner? And I show you here the Latin inscription. This worn inscription here is one of the most fascinating pieces of evidence for the trade in fish in antiquity. It is a Hellenistic inscription from Akrefnia in inland Boeotia. I mentioned Boeotia before. The inscription is a fish price list. It is divided in two parts: the marine fish that were brought to inland Boeotia from the coast, some distance away, and the local lake fish. In this description, we learn which were the most expensive fish or fish parts, belly parts of tuna, eel, and the lake fish called vorax reached top prices. The larger individuals of any species were more expensive than the smaller ones, and some fish were sold by weight and others by piece. The fish market has been a popular place in classical Hellenistic and Roman literature. It is the place where male citizens meet up, exchange news and opinions, and where correct or unacceptable social conduct was commented upon. In the literature, people's behavior in the fish market seemed to be linked to social, political, and moral values. For example, fishmongers, which were trade people, always tried to cheat their customers, most of them respectable land-owning citizens. Fish selling was not suitable occupation for women. Fish were very expensive, therefore the ability to buy lots was an indication of too much wealth and raised questions of how that wealth was obtained. Buying a lot of fish in the market without consideration for other potential customers showed undemocratic tendencies on the part of the customers. A preference for small, cheap fish by wealthy customers who could afford more expensive fish was viewed as a sign of low education and low status despite the customer's riches. The list of such examples is indeed a long one. Approaching the end of this presentation, I couldn't leave out a major sector of ancient fisheries, and that is fish processing and trade in processed fish. Fish could be salted, dried, fermented, turned into fish sauces. These products were made from a wide variety of raw materials and involved a variety of textures, ingredients, and flavors. They existed alongside fresh fish, and they played a different role both at the table and in the economies of the regions that produced and consumed them. Fish processing is associated with abundance and surplus. Fish were processed to prevent spoilage, especially in times without refrigeration or efficient transportation. For this reason, schooling seasonal fish were most often processed: tunas, mackerel, bonitos, sardines, anchovies, and so on. But there was no strict limitation, and archaeological finds show us that all kinds of aquatic animals were processed, fish as well as shellfish such as oysters, and even marine mammals such as whales, and the octopuses that I show you here. A wide variety of raw materials and techniques were used in processing in order to stop or limit decomposition. Salting, drying, brining, smoking, the use of preservative substances such as spices or vinegar, and various combinations of these methods resulted in countless products with distinct flavors and textures. And here I show you a list of terms from ancient Greek literature that refers to distinct fish products. The list is not exhaustive, but it shows you the idea. Although one primary function of processing fish and seafood was and remains even today the long-term preservation of a seasonally abundant food source, from an early stage, it also produced distinct gastronomic products, whether luxurious or humble. Those products brought wealth to the regions producing them and were widely traded precisely because they were so desirable. The production of these goods created a broad circle of economic activity and supported other sectors of the economy. Take, for example, the famous garum, the fish sauce of antiquity. Garum was a fermented product made from small fish or fish parts, such as those that you see here in these photographs. The fish were mixed with salt in specific ratios and left in the sun for some time to ferment, either in special vessels similar to the ones used today in Asia for the same purpose, or in built tanks like those found in Central and Western Mediterranean in specialized fish processing plants. Here, you see a reconstruction of such a plant. Through this process, the fish underwent hydrolysis, their flesh gradually dissolved, and the whole mass was transformed into a dark amber liquid, which is garum, this middle band here, which was then strained and packaged. Garum was packaged in special transport containers, which, according to archaeologists who study them, appear to have had their own typology. These containers, amphorae, they often bore handwritten inscriptions, the famous tituli picti that you see here on the right. And these shorthand texts describe the contents, the place of production, and sometimes even the name of the producer. Packaged garum reached all the ports of the Mediterranean and from there traveled overland to remote inland regions. Certain places were famous in antiquity for their fish products. The Sea of Azov in northern Black Sea, for example, was sending preserved fish to Byzantium, Istanbul, and to Athens, and the island of Thasos in northern Aegean was famous for its fish brine. That seems kind of expected. After all, these places are relatively close and connected in many ways. What was unexpected was an amazing find in Corinth here. In the so-called merchant's house of the 5th century before the Common Era, there have been found thousands of amphorae fragments. Some were amphorae containing wine imported from various famous wine-producing regions around the Aegean. Many amphorae, however, were different, and you can see their shapes, their basic shapes here in the drawing. They were specialized vessels known to be produced in Western and Central Mediterranean to transport, deliberately made, to transport processed fish. And stuck on some of the amphorae fragments, the excavators noticed clusters of fish scales. Analysis showed that these and most of the fish bones that were found mixed with the amphorae fragments belonged to two species, tunas and gilthead sea bream. And this is strange. Both these fish live in the waters around Greece and were common catches at the time. Tunas were processed for sure around the coasts of the Aegean at the time. So, why did consumers in the cosmopolitan harbor city of Corinth imported these products from so far away? With the red dots, you see all the places from which fish were imported in Corinth in the 5th century BC. They did that because the regions the fish were imported from were famous for their processed fish, and their economy was based on this industry. Their products were considered of excellent quality. So, Corinthian consumers, wealthy and cosmopolitan, had an appetite for luxury imported foods. After all, the table is an arena for social competition, where identities are formed and maintained. Think of caviar that plays a similar role today. Fish and other aquatic creatures in the water Fishes and fishing tools, the fish market, trade in fish products, and fish on the table are just some of the aspects of the complex and deep relationships that linked the people around the Aegean with the sea. The imaginary, the beliefs about the spirits, the deities that inhabited those waters along with the fish, had their role to play in fisheries, but this is a topic that we did not discuss today. It was, however, part of the same picture. I hope that I have shown you that fishing in ancient Aegean, as everywhere else in the world, and in every era, is not simply an act of acquiring aquatic resources to meet dietary needs. It's not faceless, it's not purely economical. Fishing is a way of life for communities who create an entire universe of actions, relationships, and ideas around it. Within these universes, knowledge and beliefs were passed down from one generation of fishermen to the next. And here, in this holistic view of fisheries, may be the key to the future and to a sustainable way to deal with the sea and its resources. Fishing is not abstract, faceless, and purely economic. It's culture, and we should treat it like that, even today. Thank you.